Last night I was having dinner with my friend Eric. It was warm enough and we had fired up the grill for the first time of the season. It was a beautiful thing. Eric and I have known each other for years. He was the interim senior pastor at the First Congregational Church in Meriden, where I was the interim associate pastor, and he refused to be my boss from the beginning. We worked as a team. And these days we make music together. So we were there having dinner, and we started reminiscing about those days in Meriden. It was 20 years ago. And thinking of that time when so many things in our lives gelled and pointed us in the directions that we would later go. It was in Meriden that I first became a chaplain. I was an accidental chaplain in many ways. You see, I was driving a used car that I had purchased from a firefighter, and it had an IAFF union sticker on it. And I ended up doing a baptism for the granddaughter of a firefighter who had seen the car, had known that I was from Virginia, put 2 and 2 together and came up with 5, and said, well, I know that you were a firefighter when you were in Virginia, and you probably aren't certified here in Connecticut, but would you be our chaplain? Well, not having been a firefighter at any point in my life, I explained this. He said, well, you got the sticker, it's okay. And so I became the chaplain for the Meriden Fire Department. And then, a couple months passed, and the firefighters were talking among themselves, and as is so often the case in the emergency services community, the firefighters started talking to the cops, and the cops came to me. In fact, I got a call from the chief saying, how come you're their chaplain and not ours? And so before I knew it, I was, well, everybody's chaplain. And, was trying to figure out which badge I needed to wear when I went to which place for which reason, depending on who had called me. And it was an interesting time. That was the beginning of my chaplaincy, working with those firefighters and police officers. I had one particular firefighter. His name was Mike. Mike was a great guy. He was with engine company number 2. And his face lit up one day when I walked into the firehouse. Padre, he said, because you're required to call your chaplain Padre, I guess. Padre, he said, my wife and I have just opened up a new restaurant, and we would like you to come and join us. Well, how could I say no? And so I got the directions, and later that week I made a point of stopping by the Poverty Point Cafe, which was adjacent to a brownfield area in a bunch of rundown buildings that, to look at, well, I was just glad that I was driving a beater of a car. Let me just say it that way. That when I parked on the street, I didn't have to worry about what might happen. They didn't have a sign out. Well, they did have a sign, but it was, okay, they had a piece of plywood that had been hand-painted, Poverty Point Cafe, and leaned up against the building. And it was dubious. But I opened the door and walked in, and the place was jammed. I couldn't even make my way to the bar. I had to shove past people just to get there. And as I started shoving in, I realized that most everybody there was wearing a uniform. There were firefighters, and there were cops, and there were people wearing EMS uniforms, and I think there was like one guy who was just wearing shorts. But they were probably uniform shorts. Maybe it was a postal worker. Anyway, everybody there was part of the team. And there I was, shoving through to get to the bar. I got up to the bar and ordered a beer. I didn't get to pick what beer I wanted. It was a beer, the one thing they had on tap. And then I started thinking about food. So what do you have on the menu, I asked. So, well, you can have a hot dog or a pickled egg. And I thought to myself, you know, you only go around once. I'll have one of each. And so Mike turned around, pulled a hot dog off the little hot dog roller grill thing like they have at like every convenience store in the world, slapped it on the bun, slapped the whole thing on a napkin and handed it to me. Now, when I say napkin, I of course mean a paper napkin. I don't mean one of those fancy schmancy hot dog holders. But, you know, drop it on a napkin, turn around, get a pickled egg out of the jar, drop that on another napkin. Pickled eggs and napkins, it's not a good combination, but you know, soaked fruit. So anyway, so I'm now juggling a hot dog and a pickled egg and a beer, and having one of the best times of my life. As I was there in this bar that was jam-packed with people that I knew from their work in the community. It was one of those really odd times, one of those odd places, because it was not a bar that had any reason to continue in existence, just between you, me, and the lamppost. But it did fine, because it was the place where all of the cops, where all of the firefighters would come and find that they were in community. It was a safe place for family. You know, a few years later, I moved to Pennsylvania, and I was remembering Mike and the Poverty Point Cafe and pickled eggs. And it was Easter, and my son Ian was a little guy. He was about 4, so of course we had just spent Holy Week dyeing 3 dozen eggs. 3 dozen hard-boiled eggs is a lot of eggs for a family of 3. And they go bad unless you put them in a jar with vinegar and spices. And so I took these Easter eggs and I cracked the shells and I stuck them in and I pickled them in a big gallon jar. And long about August, I was finishing the last one. It was a very strange batch of pickled eggs, you see, because having been former Easter eggs, they had like blue and green and yellow bruise-looking things in all of them, where the dye had come through the shells. But every time I ate one of those pickled eggs, it took me back to the Poverty Point. It took me back to that gathering of people who had been so special in my life and who had been so special in each other's lives. Gathered in that little dive of a bar in a bad neighborhood right across from the abandoned industrial zone. With little bits of Easter coloring left over. You know, I think for a lot of people, Easter is like those pickled eggs. You know, it's sort of a residual mark left over from the dye. I imagine Thomas, that Easter Sunday so long ago, going out and picking up whatever he was picking up. It had to be Chinese food. Missing that appearance of Jesus for the disciples. Coming back and hearing this wild story about the guy that they'd all seen crucified. That those crazy women had come back saying that he was alive. We all know what women think, right? Yeah, those sexist disciples, they just couldn't believe Mary. But when Jesus showed up among them and said, "Peace be with you," and showed them his hands and the hole in his side that had been made by the spear, the disciples finally believed it. But not Thomas. He missed it all. He hadn't been there to hear Christ offer peace. And when he came back and heard those crazy stories, he did what I would do. And frankly, what I expect you would all do as well. He didn't buy it either. Not until I see it will I believe. Not until I put my hands in the nail holes. Because you guys are wishful thinkers. You want to believe he's back, but we know it doesn't work that way. And for a week, Thomas had to wait. Gathering with those disciples who were still in the upper room where they'd celebrated the Passover for a whole week. And you know what? Just like at the Poverty Point Cafe where everybody was shoulder to shoulder and elbow to elbow and living in community, that's what those disciples were doing. And Thomas, the one who didn't believe a word of what the others had told him, was there with them. Part of the community, part of the family, even in his doubt. And that's when Jesus came back again. Held out his hands. Thomas, check it out. Get it. Come on. You can believe, because now you can see. You know, there were a couple miracles that took place that Easter. The miracle of Christ's resurrection, of the gift of eternal life that echoes throughout the ages and touches us today. It's the foundational miracle of our faith. It's the story that we tell. It is what makes us different from the rest of the world and claims us as Easter people who live that resurrection every day. But there's a second Easter miracle, and it's the one that we usually forget. It's the miracle that a group of terrified people gathered in an upper room who were afraid of someone coming and arresting them and nailing them up to a cross. Let someone come back in who didn't believe a word of what they were telling them. They didn't kick Thomas out. They said, you know, Thomas, we love you. We get it that you don't believe what we're telling you today. But give it time. Stay with us. Live in this community. And you too will eventually experience the risen Christ. Maybe it's not a big flashy miracle like resurrection, but to allow someone who doesn't believe what you believe to come and be part of the family is not how we as humans usually function. We like to circle up, to hang out with people who believe just what we do. Don't we? Yeah. We like to put signs in front of our churches and say, all are welcome. And we think we mean it. But so often people come in and they hear a message from the pulpit and they're told, well, that's what we believe. You better sign with the dotted line at the bottom, because if you don't, you can't be part of us. It's not us, is it? We live as a community that opens the doors, that opens the hearts, that opens the minds. Just the other week, I was talking with our confirmation class about questions, about metaphors, about ways of living even with ambiguity. And I got to tell you, our young folks get it. They don't have the answers, but man, they got the questions. And you know, I think that's better. because they know that in our community of faith, the questions are welcome. The doubt is welcome. The not even believing everything because it's not all believable is welcome. It reminds me of those pickled eggs once again. That little bit of Easter that keeps coming back to us, that gift of the resurrection, but also that gift of community and remembrance that holds us together as God's people. Because I got to tell you, at the Poverty Point Cafe, those pickled eggs weren't much. But when shared among friends, they were like a sacrament. Because they were something that the community could share. And for Mike and his wife, it was a beginning, it was a celebration, it was friendship and support. Pickled eggs, community, and questions. That's Easter, isn't it? It was then, and it is now too. Thanks be to God.